Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cloud Wars Live, where we explore today's digital revolution by speaking with thought leaders who are helping to change how the world lives, works, plays, learns, and dreams. Our guest today is the one and only Chris Lochhead, who's a regular guest of ours, part of our Digital All-Star team. Chris has been an author. Now he's a best listening or best watched podcaster, entrepreneur, marketer, thinker, and really somebody who looks at the world in a different way. So we call this series Lochhead on Different. And if you've seen Chris before, you'll understand it. If you haven't, Chris, welcome. What do you have for us today? What are you thinking about?
Dr. Evans, it's great to be here for my my annual examination.
Monthly
examination.
Yeah. I mean,
yes, well, God knows I need to be examined once a month by somebody.
So far, we're finding the outcomes, the exams have been good. It looks like you've had a particularly busy month here thinking about things. And Chris, got stuff from Mary Meeker's Internet Report, some thoughts on podcasting, polling, lots of interesting stuff. So how did some of these things pop into mind, and what do you make of them?
Well, as you know, Mary Meeker, the queen of the internet, has been producing this wonderful, deeply researched internet report since really the mid-90s. So back when FIRE was invented. And so she just came out with her most recent one, and I've started to dig into it. But a couple things right off the top that sort of struck me as an aha, something to reflect on, which is half the world, Bob, is now on the internet. 3.8 billion people are now on the internet superhighway. And I don't know about you, and we can break down the countries she's got here, which I think is also the regions, which is interesting. But on one hand, it blew me away. Wow, half the world. I mean, I can remember my first CompuServe account and Netscape going public, and so it's one of the cool things about being on the planet for a while is you get to see a cool range of shit, right? And so it's fascinating that half the world's now on the internet. Geez, what do we have to do to get the other half of the world on the internet?
Yeah. And Chris, of that other half that isn't, how many would you estimate are do that by choice versus not having the opportunity?
That's hard to know, but I would guess, is just a guess, of course, I would guess a large majority of them are not on the internet, not because of choice, because of lack of opportunity.
Yeah.
I think for the most part, and look, there's a lot of negative things, and some of it justified, and there's a lot of shitting on Silicon Valley and Facebook and whatever and Big Brother. There's a lot of negative things you could say about technology, and I'm happy to have those conversations, and I think those criticisms are very important. However, it is ridiculous to think that the growth of the internet and information technology overall has not been for the vast, large percentage of people, a massive, massive benefit. And so I think it behooves us to think about what does it take to get the other half of the planet on the internet. I don't think it's primarily a choice. And I think the more people on the internet in general, the better off we'll be.
Chris, very small and personal point on this. I know it's been interesting over the last few months as I've watched, a relatively new site that I have, cloudwars.co, where I have articles and podcast episodes up there primarily. I last check it around 11 p.m. or midnight. And then when I get up early in the morning, around 6, I look at the geographic spread, and it's, the United States falls to less than 10%. And there's, large viewership from all over the world. So, sort of this thing of following the clock, and it reflects a little bit some of the numbers you put here from Mary Meeker's report, and this ability, and you've talked about this before, for a a very small business like mine, the Chicken Chick and others, you can have a fully global audience. Yes. And I think, to your point about the value, the benefit of what the internet can do, I mean, this was completely not just unimaginable. Even if somebody could imagine it, would have been utterly impossible before. And now, not just buying and selling stuff, but changing ideas, sharing ideas, pushing innovation, just connecting with people around the world. It is a phenomenon available to everybody.
Absolutely, Bob. And there's a niche NATO going on, right? Because of the reach of the internet, you can be somebody designing a micro niche, like our friend the Chicken Chick, and have scale. And so we have these micro niches at scale. And those of us who are playing in the internet space, to your point, we never know who we're going to touch. And it's a very, very powerful thing. I, like you, get email and tweets and LinkedIn's and whatever from people all around the world. And so that's a very exciting thing. And I think what it means for, small businesses, what you could think of as small entrepreneurs, what the technology has done, primarily the cloud and everything that's come since the cloud, is allowed these micro niche businesses to scale. And I think it's a very powerful idea. I think it's a very exciting idea. I think it creates massive opportunities. And I think it's very cool that half the world's on the internet. And I think it behooves the rest of us to say, what else do we need to do? How can we welcome the other half of the world to the conversation?
Yeah. And Chris, one point too that you had noted about from Mary's report here, the percent of commerce or total sales coming from outside traditional retail over on the e-commerce side. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so she points out that e-commerce is now 15% of retail, and it's only up 1% since last year. But the interesting thing to me about that is, holy shit, Batgirl, Amazon is flirting with $1 trillion market cap. They are, of course, the massive category queen, category king in e-commerce in many, many, many categories, as you well know. And yet, look, grade 10 math was the hardest 12 years of my life, but am I reading this right? 85% of shit in America is not bought online. To the point on micro niches being able to achieve scale. Think about all of the niche commerce opportunities around the world if such a small percentage of retail is just online.
And Chris, one of the things that ties in with that you've talked about before is with young people, right, coming in, and they won't look at this and say, wow, that's weird. They'll look and say, no, this is how the world is. This is how the world operates. I can connect with people on all 7 continents.
Absolutely. And actually, that brings me to another thing I wanted to share with you. The folks at Adobe have this site called CMO.com, and I think they've done a very good job of sort of thought leadership and building their own content. And it almost looks like they're a publishing company. And some people don't even know that it's not a publishing company. Anyway, they've done a great job with CMO.com. And to your point, they recently put out something on the, quote, 15 mind-blowing stats about Generation Z that tie to what you just said. We don't have to go through all 15, but there's some interesting points here. First of all, Generation Z, as defined by Pew Research, is anyone born from 97 onward.
Okay.
And there's 61 million of these folks in the U.S. alone. 61 million people born since 97. So think about that. Do you know what year Van Halen's 1984 came out?
You tell me.
1984 is when it came out. And
see, I learn new stuff all the time from
all
you.
the time. I know, amazing knowledge, incredible. And I just look at it, and go, how's anybody born after that record came out? I don't understand. But I digress. There's 61 million of them. And here's the mind blower. According to the U.S. Census, again, this is all from CMO.com, they will be 30% of the workforce by 2030. And if you look at some of this data, it's fascinating, this survey data. 80% say they aspire to work with cutting edge technology. 80%. 91% of them said technology would influence their job choice. So if you look at the importance of technology, the internet hitting half the world, and this massive new generation, I think a very exciting generation, as fun as it is to poo-poo on millennials and now Generation Z, I actually am very excited about them. But to think that we're at a place, when you and I started our careers, most people weren't working in information technology. They maybe thought it was cool or interesting, but now 80% of young people want to work with cutting edge technology, and 91% say it's going to influence their job choice.
Well, Chris, let's look at the other side of that. One of the stats that you shared, 55% of them use their smartphones 5 or more hours a day. Now,
we are integrated with the machines, Bob. We're now one with the machines.
Yeah. Yeah, and 26% of those Gen Zs use their phones 10 or more hours a day. I don't want to offer too many details about this. I know Groucho Marx had a joke. The punchline, he says, "Well, I like cigars, but every once in a while I take it out of my mouth." So, there's something here that is, I think, inspiring, because if you can engage with the world through this device that becomes part of you, that's cool. Probably a lot of those 5 or 10 hours a day, or it's things they're doing at work, it becomes their primary work tool. But do you buy into this thing about 5 or 10 hours a day on your mobile phone is cutting into the traditional social skills of people?
Sorry, I didn't hear you. I was updating my Instagram. What was that? No, look, I think on one hand, here's what I've learned, right? A lot of things in life are a fascinating, I think, worthy of discussion and thinking dichotomy.
Mhm.
So on one hand, I don't know about you, maybe this sounds corny, but I find myself with all this technology a lot of the time going, this is awesome. I just bought this new Rode Caster Pro. It's a podcasting carbidingulator panel thing here. And it's massively improved, my podcasting. And we have these phones and these computers. And, I look at my computer sometimes and I go, like, my whole life is on this thing, right? Like I watch my favorite TV shit. I consume my favorite books and articles, and I, like you, am a small sized solopreneur with lots of help, media company. And I just go like, this phone's everything. It's my friend. It's my Star Trek communicator. It's my business. And so there's a big part of me that looks at all this and goes, isn't this amazing? Because this technology is allowing the creative people of the world to do things that we never thought were possible. So I get very excited, and the child in me with big wide eyes looks at how cool and awesome and so forth all that is. On the other hand, there's the dichotomies part of this, which is, roughly the beginning of the year, I deleted all social media with the exception of Instagram off my phone because I felt like it was too distracting for me. And recently, Bob, I went on a trip and I wasn't going to take my laptop. And so I thought, I got to download these apps and, because I don't want to be totally out of touch. I'm supposed to be in touch with the world, I think. So I re-downloaded Facebook and all the other shit, right? And today is the day I'm going to retake it all off.
Yeah.
And so on one hand, there's this awesomeness of what's possible and being able to connect with people and do creative things and work on our technology and communicate the way we are today and all the awesome, tastic stuff. And I think that can't be overstated. And then there's the flip side, which is, sometimes I find myself sitting in my beautiful garden on my phone or computer for half an hour going, what am I doing? I haven't even kind of looked up and looked at a flower. Like, I got to stop looking at this shit, right? So it's this rabbit hole we can fall into.
Chris, I thought of this when you're telling the story about sitting in your garden, and, did you see in some sense where you are? Were you in the moment at all? Or, you could have been sitting in your garage or, who knows where, an airport. What is that in Singapore, that hotel with the 3 different towers going up and connected by the
Yeah.
thing on the top? I was having lunch up there in my final days at Oracle with a great guy there from Oracle, and there were so many people up there. It's an unbelievable place. You're up 600 feet in the air. You got these views. It's remarkable. There's an infinity pool off to one side, and there were so many people running around, and they had their selfie sticks, which I know you're a huge fan of, which we've discussed, the selfie sticks. And he said, I wonder if the people who come up here doing this stuff, do they ever see what's here in real life, or do they just see it, what they see through their phone? And so again, I don't lose sleep over this. I don't worry about it. I think there are times in my life that my parents probably worried, geez, does he have to sleep with the basketball? Could he put it down for a little bit here or there? And, it might be one of those things, but there is something, I believe, a little bit, Chris, that flip side of what you talked about, the magic, the wonder, the things that are so good about it. But maybe it's one of those things, anything taken to an excess can be too much, or maybe it's just a fact that I'm going to be 63 in a couple months, and I just don't see the world the way these Gen Z folks do.
Well, that part is for sure. Neither do I. But yeah, I think life is a fascinating inquiry into a lot of things that are dichotomies. You know, on one hand, the technology is incredible, and I think it's done way more good than bad. But the flip side is we fall into this hole. The Gen Zers are spending a massive amount of time. We have integrated ourselves with the machine, and we're massively being surveilled. So
Yeah,
that's the negative part.
yeah. Well, dichotomies. You had some thoughts about the podcasting boom of which you've become a significant part. What's the yin yang with that?
So here's the exciting part. So the folks at Andreessen Horowitz, the venture capital firm in Silicon Valley, recently put out what I thought was a absolutely spectacular report on podcasting. And they consolidated some research from Edison and others, and they added some of their own stuff, and they packaged it really, really wisely. I thought it was a very compelling piece of work. Anyway, the headline for me in this is 25% of Americans now listen to podcasts. And interestingly enough, 65% started in the last 3 years.
Wow.
People who consume podcasts weekly consume on average 7 podcast episodes and spend 6 hours and 37 minutes with podcasts. And so I find this very exciting. I've always loved radio. When I was a kid, I loved talk radio. I don't know why. I love politics, and from a very young age. Maybe it's because I'm dyslexic and have all these other things. I lovingly refer to them as dysphaglia. But I listen through hearing and through through watching and participating and so forth. It's easier for me than reading. But here's the fascinating dichotomy around podcasting. We live in a world where we're told that everybody has a 2-second attention span, and you hear all this bullshit about, goldfish have longer attention spans than humans. And, God knows if any of that's true, but,
what were you saying?
Yeah, exactly. Excuse me. I'm sorry. I was on my Instagram. But here's the dichotomy around podcasting. If you believe that the smartphone has been at least a contributor to the supposed dwindling of our attention spans. And if you go to lunch or dinner with people, there's a lot of people who won't put their phones down. And so it's people are distracted. And you could argue, therefore, that the smartphone has helped destroy people sitting down, looking at each other in the eye and having a real conversation. You could make that argument. And the growth in podcasting, and in particular in dialogue podcasts like Cloud Wars, is massive. And so I find it fascinating that the technology that many people say is destroying our attention spans is actually bringing back long form conversation. And I just think that's fascinating and fantastic.
Yeah. And again, you've become, one of the top podcasters in the world. You understand this stuff. You've started to put out some promotional pieces I've seen, Chris, too, about that it's not, it can be taken down a very dangerous path, right? If you go the wrong way, it's like anything done right, it can be a beautiful exchange. And that one of the numbers you mentioned, right, is so it's an hour a day that people are spending with podcasts. So like you said, these long form pieces. So that's led you to some thinking. You said a little bit about everything from corporate podcasting to some variants of podcasting that you find to be a little bit troubling.
Yeah. So let's touch on those. If I put my CMO hat back on and I think about podcasting, I'm stunned at how many companies don't get it. And here's what I mean by don't get it. I don't think you can be a company today without a podcast. And more importantly, without a point of view, thought leadership content strategy. We talked about CMO.com. The primary sponsor of my podcast is NetSuite. It's for growth-oriented entrepreneurs. And regardless of how you want to think about it, I think today, we just did an episode of our podcast with Sangram Bajri, and he's the sort of co-founder of Terminus, a marketing automation company. And he built a thought leadership profile for himself and the company 18 to 24 months before they were even in market with a product, and drive leads for their sales force. And kind of, he created a conference, he created an amazing podcast called Flip Your Funnel. And he did all these things to sort of center himself and the company around a set of topics, ideas, and problems that he knew he was building products for, so that they would have a community. And his mantra was, if you don't have a community, then you're a commodity. And he used thought leadership, podcasting, writing, conferences, what you and I would call the media business. And so the aha is, I think you have to be a media thought leader if you're a company, and I think you have to be building a community and thought leadership around a set of topics. So that's on the external side. Here's the other one. And so most companies aren't doing that. I don't think they've figured that out. I think it's an exciting new area for companies. On the internal side, how many companies do you know, Bob, that have an internal comms podcast? If I was the CEO of any kind of company today, whether it was a small startup or a Fortune 500 company, as a CEO, I would have a weekly podcast, even if it was only 5 or 10 minutes. Hey, folks, this is what I've been working on. This, just like you would with a blog, just like you'd have a water cooler conversation. If I was the CMO of a company today, I would do the same thing. And I would have a bunch of internal comms podcasts. I would have one for the product team that is sort of shares with our organization what we're working on and when new releases are coming out and things. So think about all the stuff you used to have on an intranet. I would have podcasts. And if I was a company of any size, I might have a dozen podcasts around certain topics that are internally focused for employees to consume, so that they can continue to educate themselves, so that they can be up to date on company strategies and approaches and policies and things along those lines, things that you used to do with internal blogging. And I'm stunned that there's not more corporate podcasting.
And now a quick break to hear from our sponsor. SAP Experience Management is helping businesses connect to their customers and then connect customers back to those businesses. Just listening to your customers is not enough. Businesses need to respond, react, and relate to them as individuals. Each one of them has his or her own likes, dislikes, and preferences. By combining experience data with operational data, SAP can help your business turn customer insights into actions that make their experiences better. SAP Experience Management helps you turn customers into fanatics and products into obsessions. Learn more at sap.com/xm, the best on SAP. Now back to the show. Chris, it's fun as you were talking about that, tried to propose this idea, whatever it was, 10, 12 years ago. I was working with a sister company over in London, and the guy was in charge of communications there. I was recommending this for the CEO, and he came back the next day and he said, well, I've talked to some people about this and I think it could be a good idea, but what if somebody would make a recording of the podcast and edit it in a way that did not come out in a flattering dimension for the CEO? And I said, oh, okay, there's, what if the Martians come and, take over the building, and we're in trouble too. So,
well, and, what if your aunt had male genitalia, she'd be your uncle? Like, what? There's all kinds of what ifs you could talk about. I mean, I think that's ridiculous. I think we live at a time where my headset as a former CMO is there's no such thing as an internal communication. Right? We see it all the time. There's some kind of big news in a company and they put it out there, and in 5 seconds, somebody emails that to a reporter or whatever. You just do forward to Gmail and nobody knows what you did, right? And so we live in a world, I think, of radical transparency. We live in a world where there's no such thing really as an internal communication. So I think you have to be wise about what you put out if you're going to do internal podcasting, and realize some of the stuff's going to get out. But, who gives a shit? I think it's time we communicate. It's time we collaborate. It's time we share. And, we'd talk about some of the Jim Harder numbers from Gallup if you want. But the bottom line is, when you look at the research, employees are disengaged. Managers are disengaged at work. And so I think we as corporate leaders have to do more things to create a legendary work environment. And I think part of it is communication. I think part of it is corporate podcasting, both internal podcasts and external podcasts.
Chris, I want to get to that, some of the research you had talked about, but first just touch on this, if we could flip from a modern emerging communications medium to one that's been around for, a few thousand years, books. You had come across a few that you were kind of excited about.
Yeah, so I've read more books in the last 2 years, Bob, than I think in the last 200 years. Because, uh, I'm incredibly fortunate that we get a lot of these awesome authors on the podcast, and when they come on, of course, their PR people send me the pre-release copies of their books, and I only have people on that I'm interested in. So,
Okay.
I'm always amazed as an author myself when I go on other podcasts and the host podcaster hasn't read my book. I'm like, well, why do you even have me here? At least give it a fucking skim. It's an easy read, right? Anyways, I don't have anybody on that I don't read the book, and maybe I don't read every word on every page, but I mean, I do try to consume the book. So long story longer, there's been a couple on lately that have really struck me. And I just mentioned one. There's a new book out called It's the Manager by Jim Harter, and he's a Dr. Jim Harter, PhD, and he's the chief scientist at the Gallup organization. And they did this fascinating thing, Bob, where they did the largest study of its kind. They interviewed about 37 million people to get a real powerful set of insights around what's going on in the modern workplace. And there's a lot to unearth here, but let me just underscore the two things that jumped out at me from Jim's book. It's the Manager. 34% of workers say they're engaged at work. So,
Wow.
so you just think about that and go, most people in most companies say they're not engaged in what they're doing. And then, interestingly enough, 2/3 of managers say they're not engaged at work. So most managers are not engaged, and roughly a third, if again, correct me on the math here, of people say they're not engaged. And no shit, if your manager or your boss or your leader is not engaged, then maybe you're not going to be engaged. And so I think there's a fascinating thing here around how do we create a legendary work environment that will break this. And I'll give you an idea around this to connect a couple dots. We had this legendary sales leader on Follow Your Different not long ago. His name's Dan Cassetta, and he runs the West Coast for this amazing company called Cutco Knives. And Dan was the guy that had this insight many years ago, because most of their teams are younger folks, right? So they often have employees who work for them for 2 or 3 months over the summer, who are coming out of high school, going into college, going through college. They have people who stay beyond that, but a lot of young people. And so his aha was, how do we train and motivate young people to be incredibly successful selling knives? And here was the aha. And the mantra is changing lives by selling knives. So he said, what if we turn ourselves into a personal growth, personal development, career development company that happens to sell knives? So the culture they've created is one that's deep on recruiting, deep on what we used to call enculturation, installing culture, deep on training and resilience and relationship building. And so they sort of imagine if Tony Robbins and Jim Rohn and sort of all these sort of Zig Ziglar and all these sort of personal development and business and life development coach type folks swizzled all their shit up and turned themselves into a knife selling company. That's sort of what Dan led at Cutco, and they've been incredibly successful at it. So anyway, here's the aha I had. What if more companies thought that way? What if GE or IBM or Cisco or whoever said, we're not selling software, we're not selling databases, we're not selling carbodynulators. We're a personal growth, personal development company. The number one thing we care about is the growth and success of our people for the time they're with us and the time they're alumni. We're not going to treat them like shit when they leave. We're going to treat them like treasured alumni, right? And we want our company to be the defining place, the defining experience in their career that for them, there's a before and after they work with us. Maybe some of them spend their whole career with us. Maybe some of them spend a few years with us. But regardless, we want to have such a powerful impact on them personally that we're the defining experience of their career that sets them up for success, either with us over the long term or in other places. That's a very different shift in headset. And I would posit to you that the Dan Cassetta Cutco mindset enables companies to have much more engaged managers and employees than the horrifying stats coming out from the Gallup organization. And I think as work and life are more and more blurred, I think more companies need to have the Dan Cassetta mindset to change these, I would call, troubling stats from Jim Harter.
Well, Chris, a few thoughts on that. One is, you talked earlier about some of the stats with the Gen Z folks. I just don't see a lot of them saying, "Oh yeah, I'll go work at this place where I'm disengaged, and sure, I'll stay there 4 or 5 or 6 years." No, they're going to track over toward the sort you mentioned. I bought a set of Cutco knives from a high school kid several years ago. They're unbelievable, and at one point he was so excited, he was so pumped up. The scissors that come with the knife set, he was going to show me how to cut a penny in half, but he said he had smashed his finger playing some sort of sports, and he said, I might not be. I said, that's okay. I trust you that it'll cut the penny in half. We'll keep that penny. That remarkable culture that you're talking about there, improving lives, selling knives that Cutco has here, made me think as well of your conversation recently with Andre Iguodala, right? He voiced a similar thing, set yourself up, make a plan, be ready, go attack this and have a model in place to follow through.
Yeah, and the other thing Andre talked a lot about, of course, in that same vein, is the culture that they've developed at the Golden State Warriors, right? And people talk about culture, and look, I'm guilty of it myself. I hear the word culture, and then all of a sudden what comes up for me is, oh, here comes HR bullshit, and you sort of have this slightly, as a 30-year veteran of the the corporate world, slightly jaundiced. Oh, we're going to have a HR corporate culture offsite in Half Moon Bay. Oh, fuck, and we're going to fall backwards and we're going to catch each other and all that stuff, right? So if you sort of wash your brain out about whatever sort of silliness you've been associated with in the past and begin to think about the Dan Cassetta mindset, which is, hey, maybe our job here as a company is to help build legendary leaders and people, right? If you believe the mantra that leaders don't create followers, leaders create more leaders, then you say, well, look, maybe you're an employee with us for one summer, maybe you're an employee with us for the rest of your lives, but no matter what, we're going to put together a culture and an approach and some training here that is going to be material in powerfully and positively impacting your life. And if you think that's your number one job, and in the case of Cutco, selling knives is the number two job, all of a sudden things change. And I've met a lot of Cutco people now, and they're all unbelievable. It's like they're positive, they're driven, they're personable, they know how to build a relation. I mean, they have learned some, as Napoleon Dynamite said, they've learned some skills. And I just thought, like, imagine if a company like Salesforce viewed itself, or Oracle, or Cisco, or IBM, or GE viewed itself as a company whose job it was is to build this culture and do this legendary training and to impact people's lives by selling knives. It's Dan did a 180, and I think that 180 is what we need to do in the corporate world. And I think, Dan Harter it's Dan Cassetta, Jim Harter from Gallup, and his new book, It's the Manager. These data are very troubling, I think, when you say that 2/3 of managers are not engaged. And I think we have to think about work in different ways as a result.
Yeah, man, absolutely. And, you talked a minute ago, Chris, about that blurring of lines between personal and professional. I think that's a path we're on now that's never going to change. It's going to, I think, become more intense. So how do companies try then to compete on that level of, this is how it's going to be? Do you want to have that personal and professional life mixed in a way that's sort of boring and then make your personal life boring? So the stakes are higher than ever before with that. And, one of the lines that you had passed over to, I want to be sure you get a chance to talk about Scott Galloway and some of the ideas you had there. The one point you sent over, the happiness graph is a smile.
Yeah. So I think this is fascinating. We just had Professor Galloway on the podcast, and look, I don't agree with everything he says, but I think he's a very fascinating guy, very smart guy, and a guy worthy of paying attention to. And he's an NYU Stern prof, and he does a lot in the area of marketing and technology and, in the world you and I live in. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, this is his second book. It's called The Algebra of Happiness, and it's a research-based look at happiness, which I find fascinating. I'm very drawn to sort of data-oriented books around how you design a legendary life. Anyway, one of the big findings that he looks at in the book is, he says the happiness graph is a smile. So if you think about happiness over time, it looks like a smile. And I'm paraphrasing him, of course, but here's what he says. In the Western world, so forget rest of world for a sec. In the Western world, what the data tells us is that, from 0 to 20, for most people, pretty happy. You're playing football, or maybe today you're playing video games, and you're going to high school, and you're chasing girls and drinking beer, and doing all the stuff that you do from 0 to 20. And so happiness is pretty high on the chart. And then he says around 25 or so is he calls it shit gets real time, right? And then happiness starts to drop off as we go to work, and we build our careers, and we meet spouses, and many of us decide, of course, to collaborate on the manufacture of other human beings, and the combination of being in relationships and creating human beings, and driving our career forward. Essentially from 20 to 45, 50-ish, you got to carry a lot of water. You got to get a lot of shit done. And so the curve in terms of happiness over time drops because we're busy. We're working 60, 80 hours, 100 hours a week in some cases. And, we got to deal with all that stuff. And then if we achieve any level of success, and we have a reasonably decent career and a reasonably decent, marriage and relationships, and maybe we're reasonably okay at making people, we sort of get through that sort of 25 to 45 period where we're really hunkered down on life. And we begin to come out the other side, and we begin to have a little bit of perspective, and maybe we've made a little bit of money, and maybe we're feeling more comfortable in our own skin. We know who we are better, et cetera, et cetera. The happiness curve starts to go back up. And so I thought it was a very fascinating insight. I think it's a profound one. And I think it's one that all of us should realize that, there's a point in our life where we're going to hunker down, and we're going to get focused on things. And maybe we're not going to have as much time to play, and maybe our happiness will diminish somewhat. But there's hope on the other side, Bob.
There is. And Chris, I think what you were talking about, like what Cutco's doing, maybe Cutco wants to take the dip out of that smile, make it a little bit more of a straight line.
Well, and it's interesting you connect the dots that way, because I do too, right? So if you take the Jim Harter from Gallup research on disengagement, and you take the happiness graph and you connect them, you go, I wonder if we were creating an environment at work where more people were engaged, would that happiness graph change? And I think a lot of companies, my experience is primarily in, the greater kind of San Francisco Bay, Silicon Valley area. I think a lot of companies have focused on some cool things. They give their employees free food and dry cleaning. And if you've ever been to the Facebook campus, by way of example, it's like fucking Disneyland, Epcot Center, and so it's a very, it's a nice environment where like they do all this stuff for you, and they make it easy for you to be at work forever and all that. But I think the sort of the coddling and the value added services, so to speak, are nice. But I think what most people want is to be in a job where they feel valued, where they feel like they're contributing, where they feel like they can be creative, where they feel like they can be productive, whether they feel like they can be innovative, and they could be making a difference. And I think the fact that the company offers free food and laundry is a nice thing. But I don't know, let me say it this way. The engagement level at Cutco is very different than the engagement level at the average company. And while Cutco might have some of the fringy things of a Facebook, they've focused on, and look, maybe Facebook's doing substantive things too, so I don't want to throw them under the bus necessarily, but clearly the things that speak to our heart, that speak to what we all want, particularly as younger people at work, which is to feel like we're being groomed and developed for a successful career, and that we have a path, and that our work is valued, and we're on a team that we respect, and there's very little politics and bullshit and those sorts of things. I think those things matter more than the free laundry.
Yeah, Chris, and I'm not disputing Professor Galloway's data or conclusions, anything like that. It sounds like a really powerful set of ideas he's put together. But the one thing about that in there, like those 20 to 50, 25 to 50 years in there. The one part that you said, yeah, I agree. You got a lot going on. There's a lot of responsibility, but if the work stuff is put in the right context, it doesn't seem like such a heavy thing. It shouldn't rob you of your smile. But the other point about it, like having a family, having kids, I've been very, very lucky in a lot of different ways. There's never been anything that remotely approaches the joy and happiness of having children that I've experienced, for all the other good stuff. So maybe that ties in a little bit with, if you feel like you go to work and you come back, it's not like one bit of drudgery to another. I'm not sure, but maybe that reflects, if the work side of that gets picked up, I think that other stuff will blossom as well. So you're onto a lot of good things there, Chris. And it's a powerful range of ideas today, but it sounds like, I have to say too, tell us just for sure, so that everybody knows, how can they Follow Your Different? And I want to say, I don't think I've ever seen you as happy and as engaged and into what you're doing, and just as your curiosity is growing. I don't mean to say you're curious or weird, but your level of engagement and interest is soaring. It's wonderful to see. You don't have to turn stuff off, because you've completed one career.
Well, it's fascinating to, at least in my case, in your late 40s, to do a giant stop, change, start, right? And start over with this, in my case, this new world of authoring and podcasting. But the amazing thing about it for me is, and of course, this is a old legendary truth for a reason. If you want to learn, become a teacher. And there's no such thing as a legendary teacher who isn't a legendary student. And so the thing that's happened for me, particularly since I started writing, because that required doing a bunch of research and engaging in content in a deep way. And then that got multiplied even further in the 2 years that I've been podcasting. Like I said, in the last 2 years, we've had an unbelievable run of legendary authors on our podcast. And I read the books. And so I've read 30 or 40 books in the last couple years, and some of them are from pretty smart folks like Jim Harter, like Scott Galloway. We had Ken Blanchard on, one of the 25 best-selling authors of all time, One Minute Manager. And, we recently had Safi Bakal on, who's written this amazing new book called Loon Shots. I think we might have touched on that as well. But anyway, so here's the thing. I think thinking about thinking is the most powerful thinking you can do. And when you engage in other people's thinking, and that sparks thinking for you, and then you start to connect dots that maybe you hadn't connected, in some cases maybe some others hadn't connected, because you're engaging in ideas and thinking and research and perspectives of smart people, I think that opens you up. And so look, I know it's a corny line, but leaders are readers. I've always been that way. And the good news, for me is, and I think it's contributed to my happiness, is I now have the time to have these incredible conversations with these incredible thinkers and incredible authors and connect new dots. And it's very stimulating. It's very vitalizing, if that's a word, for your brain. Look, and this is something I think we have to change about our education system. Learning's fun. And there's lots of ways to learn. I think the growth in podcasting shows there's a lot of people who are willing to engage in ideas and thinking and cool stories. And, some of it's pure entertainment, which is fine. And some of it's much more educational. And you look at all the awesome TED Talks, and you look at what, universities like Stanford have done with putting all this amazing content online, and, all of it, right? It's just, now's the greatest time in history if you want to be smart. And if you're stupid today, you're really stupid, because it's easy to get yourself smart, or easier, I should say.
Fair enough. Well, I know at one point in your career, you had a title of chief exclamation point. So maybe now you're on your way to give yourself the title of chief dot connector.
I'll take it.
Sounds great. Well, Chris, as always, a pleasure talking with you. You fire out lots of ideas and give the support behind it and the enthusiasm and a perspective. And where can people go to Follow Your Different and hear some of these great conversations?
The best place to find me is at lochhead.com, LOCHHEAD.com.
Perfect. Perfect. All right, brother. Thank you. It's a pleasure as always. And to all of you who've watched or listened, thanks so much. Chris will be back with us next month for more goodness, more mind-bending experiences, and more dot connecting. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Bob.